Thank you all very much indeed for coming along, so to speak, this evening in Australia and this morning here in the United Kingdom. I'm John McCarthy. I'm an advisor with Asialink. I'm a former Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade officer whose experience is principally in Asia and the United States. I'd like to welcome Dr. Bobo Lo, who's a long-standing colleague and a highly respected colleague from both the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and in academia. He has extensive experience in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in relation to Russia, where he was posted, and also as an academic dealing with China. And he has lectured extensively in China over a number of years. He has strong affiliations with the Lowy Institute in Sydney and a background with a number of other academic institutions, including Chatham House in London. So welcome, Bobo. Your experience, particularly in Russia-China relations, I think is extremely valuable at this time. And obviously you're very much sought after for your expertise. So that's quite understandable given what's happening. But I'd just really like to go through a number of issues which are very much extant with the Ukraine crisis and get your perspectives on them. Look, I think the first thing is things, do seem to be moving quite quickly politically, although not necessarily that quickly on the ground in Ukraine. Just a very straightforward question. Where are things at in Ukraine now, both militarily and politically, given the suggestions of breakthroughs that are emanating from the media quite often, suggestions that there might be grounds for some sort of agreement between Ukraine and Russia?
John, very good to see you. A great pleasure to do this event for Asialink. So I think we've got a two-track process at the moment, a military track and a diplomatic track. The military situation is somewhat static at the moment. The original Russian blitzkrieg has clearly failed. So we've moved into a more attritional phase, whereby the Russians are trying to surround various cities and to pound them into submission. The most obvious cities being Kharkiv and Mariupol. They're also trying to cement their control over the Donbass region, the southern part of Ukraine, and trying to create a land bridge to Crimea, and also to try and cut off Ukraine from the sea. Some people look at this as an attempt at partition. We'll see that. I don't think Putin has given up on taking Kiev. I think he's rather hoping that in time, the West will get bored with Ukraine, Russia will learn from its mistakes, the Ukrainian will to resist will be eroded, and eventually Russia will get it sorted, and there will be an agreement very much on Russian terms. Now, there's also a diplomatic track, but unlike most people, perhaps, I'm somewhat pessimistic about the outcome of these talks that are going on. I think Putin wants to look like Russia is being reasonable, but the kind of people that he's sent for these talks are low level and with no real decision, in fact, zero decision-making authority. They have no significant negotiating powers. So I think it's more an attempt by Moscow to look reasonable as opposed to just trying to, being seen to trying to pound the Ukrainians into submission.
Why are these suggestions constantly coming out? It would seem, some at least from Moscow, but also from Ukraine, that there are real opportunities here. For example, the possibility of Ukraine joining the EU. The suggestion coming out of Moscow about 3 days ago that they have moved into another phase, which is just to take the Donbass, leaving the Mariupol option a bit open, but suggesting that their ambitions are less extensive than many thought, say, 2 or 3 weeks ago. Is this disinformation to have people to look accommodating, or is it something to make the West, if you like, more relaxed on these issues, to try and accommodate global opinion to a greater extent? It may be a mix of these things, but I'd be very interested in your perspective on that.
I think, as you've identified, John, it's a mix of motivations, but there's also an element of Richard Nixon's leave and declare victory approach here. It's obvious that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has gone very, very poorly for Putin. So the question is, how do you massage the messages, manage the information / disinformation so that it doesn't look like a crushing Russian defeat? And one way to do that is to say, well, we were only going for the Donbass in the first place, and job done. You know, yes, it was a bit tougher than we thought it would be, but ultimately we managed to occupy the rest of the Donbass, create a land bridge to Crimea, and therefore we achieved our objectives, and now we can go back. Now, the problem with that is that that will be an extraordinarily poor result, given the amount of blood and treasure that has been spent by Russia, let alone the sort of casualties of the Ukraine. Putin will have been seen to have lost, and no amount of disinformation, information massaging in Russia will counter that impression. Perhaps more importantly, Putin himself will have felt that he had lost. This is a guy for whom, I mean, people constantly talk about off-ramps. I think Putin looks at off-ramps as something that losers have. The only off-ramp that he wants is the other guy's unconditional surrender. And so I don't really see that he will be satisfied with such a middling outcome. Ultimately, Putin wants a Ukraine that isn't part of the Russian Federation, but a little bit similar to, say, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland during the Cold War. In other words, the sort of Brezhnevian concept of a limited sovereignty. So these countries, like Ukraine, like Belarus, would be able to manage their own affairs to some extent, but their foreign policies would be essentially dictated by Moscow. And so this is why, if Ukraine became a so-called neutral state, as some people are proposing, along the lines of Austria or Finland, or if it became an EU member or on the sort of a membership track of the EU, that would represent an incontrovertible, decisive defeat for Putin. And Putin knows this. And this is why I think he's never say never, of course, but he's a long way from accepting such a mediocre, indeed downright poor outcome for himself.
If what you say is right, and I think what you say has a lot of credibility and quite a lot of support, the problem is that if he continues to lose troops at the rate he does, and if he, although he has some funds, I mean, the country isn't broke yet, but if the economy continues to deteriorate, what in the end happens, say, 3 to 6 months down the track? Where is he left if he hasn't really succeeded in taking a significant part of Ukraine? What's the story for him? What sort of internal resistance is there going to be in Russia?
What would Russia look like after 3 to 6 months of what we've seen over the last month? I think Russia would be irretrievably weakened. But having said that, would Putin be, I get from the thrust of your question is, would Putin actually maybe be unseated? Well, I don't think so. I mean, there are several issues here. One is that you've got to ask yourself, who would feel lucky enough to try and attempt a coup or lead a coup or some kind of putsch? Who would be the first person to lift their heads above the parapet, say within the Putin elite, and say, this guy has to go? I don't think anyone has that courage. They're so embedded in his circle that I don't see anyone really having the guts or the desperation to undertake such an act. It's possible, again, anything is possible, but I feel it's very unlikely. The second issue is, of course, even if they felt motivated to challenge him, could they get at him? Would they have that access? I mean, we've seen those sort of pictures in the Kremlin where even with Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov, they are about 25 feet away from him. So you have to ask yourself, is anyone able to get close enough to Putin to unseat him or do worse even? And I don't see that. I think also another point is that the war, for all the disinformation that's taking place in Russia, the war is essentially more or less popular in Russia. Or maybe I should put it differently. Putin's position is seen as being the right one, a justified reaction to the provocation that caused by the West of NATO enlargement and all that. So in other words, even if the war itself is seen as unfortunate, even if the costs are great, the point is it's not Russia's fault. It's not Putin's fault. It is seen to be the fault of the West. And so there's no real pressure either at the general public level or within the Putin elite for a change of course. And that's the problem. Now, that could change if Putin, for example, were to escalate matters so that it's not just about Ukraine, but it becomes a military clash between Russia and NATO. Or perhaps Putin might go down first we'll do chemical weapons, and then eventually we might go for a tactical nuclear strike. And then there might be people within the elite to say, God, this guy is going to kill us all. He's got to go. But I don't think we're there yet. I think Putin still has some way to go through his conventional military playbook.
Looking at that situation, you see really elements of stalemate continuing at least for weeks and possibly months. Where do you see this stalemate as leaving, first of all, the West, and here I mean the United States and NATO essentially, and secondly, China? Because both of them are watching, they both have very complicated scenarios to deal with. The initial view is that I think the American administration has come out looking better than people expected it to, Biden's mistakes notwithstanding, and that the Chinese look as if they're slightly wrong-footed on all this. They're trying essentially to deal with two issues. They want to keep their respectability with a large part of the world, but also they need to support Putin. They've got very good reasons for supporting Putin in the sense that it distracts the Americans. What's your sense of the overall position of both those groups? I mean, NATO in the West and China, as a result of what is happening now and as this situation continues in the Ukraine?
Well, the first thing to say is that Putin has done an absolutely magnificent job in giving the West an unprecedented unity. A unity, frankly, it's not seen since the early 1990s. I think Putin has revived the concept of a unitary West. which had become severely discredited, I would argue, in recent years. But the challenge for the West, can the West maintain its solidarity, its unity? Well, of course, so much depends on events in Ukraine. If Putin, for example, escalates matters either horizontally, so it becomes a wider conflict with the West, or vertically, chemical, nuclear route, then I think Western unity will hold. In fact, it'll be even stronger. But if Putin is smart and looks like he's open to some kind of quote unquote reasonable accommodation that takes account of Russia's so-called legitimate interests, then we might start to see fissures within the Western camp start to open up. So, for example, many countries within the NATO alliance, they sort of think, well, they still believe that they can work with Russia, that in a sense, they feel slightly guilty that NATO might have brought this whole crisis onto itself. So there's still a large hand-wringing element to this whole thing. But as long as Putin continues to escalate, Western unity will hold tight. China's in a very difficult position because I think in their meeting, in their summit on February the 4th in Beijing during the Olympics, I think Putin would have told Xi Jinping, we're going to go in, but it's going to be a walk in the park. It'll be over in a few days. Yes, there'll be Western sanctions, but, you know, there'll be more hand-wringing than actually effective sanctions. And essentially, the world will be presented with a fait accompli, and they'll just have to live with it. So the more unsuccessful Russia has been, the longer the conflict has gone on, the bloodier it has become, the more brutal and barbaric it has become, the worse China's conundrum, because it wants to hold on to the Sino-Russian partnership, because it knows giving up on Russia means that it will be strategically isolated. It's not going to get that much credit from the West, certainly not from the United States, if it distances itself from Russia. So it wants to hold on to the Sino-Russian partnership. But it is also aware of the long-term reputational damage. It's also aware that of the very real threat of secondary sanctions imposed on China. So the way the Chinese are trying to manage the problem is rhetorical, moral, political support for Russia. So continue to say that it's NATO's fault essentially, but actually on the ground doing very, very little to help Russia. So no minimal assistance on sanctions busting, no assistance on military, and essentially just say, talk a lot, but do as little as possible. I think that's a Chinese approach to trying to sort of thread the eye of the needle.
There's one issue in relation to China's approach to this whole question of Ukraine, which constantly comes up in the Western media. And that is, you know, how will it impact on the manner in which they handle the Taiwan issue? Are they likely to try and push the envelope a bit, given the West's distracted? All these sorts of options are being tossed around. What's your sense on that?
There are a couple of upsides to Russia's invasion of Ukraine for China. One is that China is no longer, at least for the time being, the #1 bad guy in the world. The second is it's obviously diverted focus away from the Indo-Pacific to Europe. But there are bigger problems for China, as I've mentioned. The conundrum, it's trying to sort of balance its, hold a very delicate balance. But it's also made the forcible reunification of Taiwan down the road, I think, more rather than less unlikely. I think it's because what it's shown is the very real limitations of military power as a means of pursuing your geopolitical objectives. But it's also shown that the United States and the West can get its act together in extremis. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of this whole crisis has been how much the United States has been invested in trying to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and how much it has led the West in trying to achieve this objective. Now, Ukraine, we must remember, is an peripheral priority of US foreign policy. Ukraine is an area that basically the United States ordinarily would simply like to forget about. So if the United States can be that exercised about a peripheral priority like Ukraine, how much more invested is it going to be in relation to Taiwan? And I think that's the lesson that the Chinese will absorb, that any attempt to forcibly reunify Taiwan with the mainland will run into extremely heavy traffic that will make basically Western unity over Ukraine look like a relatively small thing. So I can see the Chinese thinking that, well, I'm not saying that they were even considering forcible reunification of the mainland in the next few years, but I think it's certainly pushed it back a long way. I think they will look at other methods to achieve their objectives, because the military route has been so obviously exposed as inadequate and even counterproductive.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, one issue I just throw into the ring is that I take your point totally about the strategic value of Ukraine to the United States, and it is not the most important area for it in terms of dealing with its own American security. However, it does assume enormous importance in terms of where the United States is at as a world leader right now, and the impact of that on globally. I think it also obviously matters in terms of the perception that the United States has weakened in recent years, and the need to correct that perception, and that's obviously very much on Biden's mind, I think. But I'd like to come around to another point here, which is, again, relates to this question of the United States and China to some degree. And that is, how the rest of the world regards this set of issues emanating from Ukraine. In Australia and here in London, in the UK, where we both are, we're basically very, very much fed on the Western perception of what is happening. And we've come out, I think correctly, with a very condemnatory view of Putin on all this. But this view isn't shared. And I know the Americans and others, point to UN resolutions of, 141 condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 35 abstaining and 5 siding with the Russians. That's right, but it avoids the fact that some of those countries which abstained are enormously important. They're not NATO, but they include, in Latin America, Brazil and Mexico. They include India, of huge importance to us. They include Vietnam, which is a very key country in terms of our strategic disposition towards China. And in fact, if you look at population terms, it's more than well over half the world. So that is significant. What is also very significant, I think, is that those countries opposing sanctions are even more numerous than those that have abstained on this whole question of Russian aggression. Those opposing sanctions include, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, all countries that matter to us in terms of our dealings with China. So, my sense is it's not quite as rosy as it appears in terms of global opposition towards what Putin is doing. There is even more opposition towards sanctions policy. And the question, I guess, is, are we looking at the Western view in too positive a way from Australia? Are we of the view that, you know, we have won the battle for public opinion here globally? I sense we haven't got it quite right, and we need to do quite a lot of work, particularly with big meetings like the G20 coming up, with the APEC meeting hosted by Thailand even later, with the East Asia Summit taking place. All these questions will raise, all these meetings will raise the question of what do we do with the Russians? And so, you know, I think it's quite a big issue, and something that we're only just beginning to focus on. So I'd be very interested in your perspective on that, Bobo.
It's very interesting that you mention the UN vote. In Western circles, we focus on the number of those who voted for the resolution versus the number, the very tiny number, 5, who voted against. But I think the more relevant figure is the number of abstentions. It's the abstentions that show, that reflect a view among some countries that there are no winners here, and they don't want to pick sides, literally.
And not just the number, but who they were too. I mean,
exactly. So, but the number is important because it's a number of African countries as well.
Sure.
So it's not just. You know, a lot was made of the Kenyan permanent representative speech, which was very eloquent. But there are plenty of other African states, like South Africa, like Algeria, that take a pretty different view, and that fundamentally blame the West for this problem. And it is a Western conceit that, for example, when we talk about globalization, we really mean US-led economic globalization. When we talk about a rules-based international order, we think it's a universal order. But really, for much of the non-West, it's a Western order. Now, we may agree or disagree with this interpretation, but it's certainly an interpretation that is widely held throughout much of the non-West. So, for example, when we see a G7 summit, it looks like a Western club, because that's essentially what it is. And so it's a very real problem that the West has, and the United States in particular, of propagating liberal values and norms and institutions and saying, this is really worth saving. We need to nurture this, particularly since the West itself has had so many problems in recent times. We've had the Trump era, the Boris Johnson Brexit era. You have countries like India, which are democracies, but are also heading in an increasingly illiberal direction. So this whole concept of a rules-based international order is viewed with considerable suspicion by, frankly, much of the world. Now, how do you change those perceptions? Well, I think twofold. One is that Western countries have to do a much better job with governance in their own countries. So in other words, we have to demonstrate not only to the world, but to our own publics that liberal norms, values, and institutions are more effective than any of the alternatives. We have to show that we believe in them and that they work. But the other thing we have to do, is more specifically with Russia, is it's no good saying, you know, descending into bromides about Russia is on the wrong side of history, it's in breaching the rules-based international order, because to much of the world, these are just bromides. We should be emphasizing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is essentially an imperialist adventure by an imperial power. And so we need to, in a sense, try and get into some of the narratives that are floating around in the developing world, in the non-West, that this is a classic case of imperial aggression emanating from the Kremlin. That's the narrative that we should be pushing, rather than blathering on about, you know, right side of history, rules-based international order, and so on.
Yeah, no, I think what you say has considerable merit on that, Bobo. There's one aspect, I think, of the whole issue of where a lot of what used to be called the non-aligned movement countries stand. And these are the countries I mentioned. I think one of the issues we have to face is that the countries that are at best ambivalent about Western policy on Ukraine, and here India, I think, is probably the most prominent for us anyway. But also, I think Vietnam is crucially important now in terms of our dealings, Australian dealings, American dealings with China, and of course Indonesia, which is so crucial to us. All those three countries are very important to Australia in the context of dealings with China, and these are the countries with which we are likely to have, I don't want to use the word friction, but differences on this Ukraine issue. And I think make the comment that that's going to have to be very, very carefully managed, particularly if you've got something like the G20 coming up in Jakarta, which is hugely important for domestic political reasons to Jokowi, the president of Indonesia. Mm-hmm. These things I think have to be very carefully watched. It's all too easy for the Australian political class to sort of, particularly with an election coming up, to sort of stand up on the soapbox and talk about freedoms, the alliance, when these issues are just a lot more complicated for the countries that we're seeking to influence on China questions. And that's just a comment on my part. But Bobo, I'd like just to finish off. This is, I'm afraid, the sort of question that people get asked on TV all the time. And it sounds simple, it sounds a bit simplistic also, but it's, I think, important. Where do you see things standing on the Ukraine 3 months hence? Where are we going to be at if you were looking at a crystal ball?
I see no diplomatic resolution over the next 3 months. In some ways, not the least bad outcome, but a manageable outcome is a gradual dialing down of the conflict so that it becomes what's known in the post-Soviet space as a frozen or semi-frozen conflict. So what we had in the Donbass area in between 2014 and now, just sort of a low-level conflict. There will be occasional skirmishes. There will be loss of life. After all, between 2014 and 2021, 14,000 people were killed in this conflict. So it's not exactly nothing. But somehow there is a minor dialing down of, a dialing down of the conflict to more or less manageable proportions. So not this sort of sharp escalatory path that we've seen. That's what I would hope for, and I think is possible. The more radical solutions like, well, gosh, maybe there will be a solution, a diplomatic solution, I think really depends on Putin leaving the Kremlin. Joe Biden was, used his words, most unfortunately, but in a sense, he was telling a truth that as long as Putin sits in the Kremlin, there will be no resolution of the Ukraine war. He has to go. So even if his successor, whoever that might be, were a hardliner from the security and intelligence apparatus, the fact that that person wouldn't have been the personal decision maker behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine at least gives the successor a certain room for maneuver. And so it might be possible to achieve some kind of negotiated solution further down the line. But as long as Putin sits in the Kremlin, I can see no resolution of this issue. And I think he will sit in the Kremlin for at least another 3 months, which is your timeline.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Bobo. We appreciate your wisdom and your perspicacity enormously on these issues. You've got considerable expertise on them. It's really very, very valuable to us, not only in Asialink, but the wider audience. So we've gone well over our 30 minutes, so I think we better close up now there. So thank you very much indeed.
It's my pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thank you.